Are we a community?
No, you're the same species, remember?
What about now?
Oh, yeah, that's definitely a community. It's a bunch of different species living in the same area. I'm alive. Well, what about this? Is this a population or a community? Well, maybe it depends on who you ask or what questions you're asking. Okay. First glance, I'd say stock photo of population, right? All the same species hanging out together, sharing genes, one presumes, I guess. But if you're a community ecologist, you would say community, right? Multiple species hanging out, right? All the candida living on their skin. Um, that dude has a staph infection. Um, this guy probably has syphilis or something. Okay. So, depending on how you look at something, it's very rare to find just like a population in nature, right? You can do it in a lab, but there's always multiple species hanging out together. Even so, you can look at this and ask population ecology questions, right? Birth and death rates, immigration, emigration, that kind of thing. But you could also look at this and be studying community ecology. Right? So that's what we'll be talking about. It's communities. And that's interactions between the different organisms living in the same spot. Not necessarily sharing genes, although with horizontal gene transfer that can happen. Okay. But we've got inter and intra-specific interactions, just like inter and intramural sports. Okay, inter is between different species, intra is within the same species. So we've got competition for resources between different species or within the same population of species. We've got predation, right? That one makes sense. Here's a lovely chimpanzee eating the infant baby of one of the rival males in a group. We call that cannibalism when it's intraspecific predation. Then we've got symbioses between different species and within the same species. These symbioses exist on a spectrum. Right? This is showing candida, which is a yeast, a little fungal critter living on human skin. Okay. Most of the time, if we're in a good place, this is a mutualistic relationship. Okay, but it can become a parasitic one. All of these are symbiotic relationships. Symbio means living together. Doesn't have to be good. Right? Mutualistic, we've got candida hanging out on your skin. What's it get out of the relationship? It gets food and a place to live. Okay, what do you get out of it? Well, you've got candida there. It's not hurting you, but it's taking up those resources, all those oil secretions, right? It's taking up space, and all of that help prevent infection. So you get a scratch on your arm, candida's there blocking the way, taking all the resources. So there's less Staph aureus hanging out. So you're benefiting, and it's benefiting. That's mutualistic. Commensal is one of the organisms benefiting, the other one getting no benefit and no detriment. Okay, this is evolutionarily very unstable because if one organism is benefiting, the other's getting nothing. There's an evolutionary pull for the one organism to become a parasite, or for the host organism here to get something out of it, mutualistic. Okay, so this is on an evolutionary knife edge. It's always teetering towards mutualism or parasitism through evolutionary time. Okay, but again, commensalism, one organism getting a benefit, the other getting nothing. All right, and then parasitism. With candida, when it becomes parasitic, we call this a disease named thrush. So you may have seen like dental patients, their mouth is just covered with thrush. That's because this is one of those dimorphic fungi. Typically it lives like a little budding yeast, but it can start growing hyphae. All right, and it's perfectly happy to eat your flesh. And so that's what it's actually doing here. So when this mutualism goes wrong and the candida decides to start eating you, that's a parasite, and that's not good. For another look at this spectrum, okay, here we've got mutualistic down on the bottom right. A butterfly is getting nectar, but it's also pollinating the plant, both benefiting. Here's commensal. We've got birds following around an elephant. Okay, why do they do this? Well, elephants take lovely big poos, and in those lovely big poos are flies laying eggs, growing into maggots, and the birds get to eat those. So the elephant doesn't care about the birds, it doesn't get anything from them, but the birds are benefiting from following elephants around. And then here we've got two organisms, a human being and a nematode living in the human's eye. That is bad for the human, good for the nematode, so that's a parasitic relationship. Of course, this commensal one, when we studied it more closely, we found out that the elephants were actually benefiting. Yes, dun dun dun. We just weren't looking at the right things, okay? So we studied it closer, and it turns out that these birds are eating maggots in elephant poo. A lot of those maggots happen to be parasitic flies on the elephants, and so the elephants are actually getting a benefit from this. Their parasite load is reduced when the birds follow them around, okay? It's just another example of commensalisms being really, really rare, if existent at all, in nature. What's probably happening is that if we think we see a commensalistic relationship, we're just not looking closely enough, right? They're probably either parasitic or mutualistic. All right, let's talk about competition. Competition is what happens when multiple species are sharing the same area. And competition is bad for everybody. Everybody gets less out of competition. Okay? If you're competing for the same resource, that's not beneficial for either species. Okay? But a lot of species do happen to live in the same areas, and some of them are competing for each other, for the same resources. You can kind of look at this as resource gradient, whether solar wavelength, okay, or temperature, or location on the rocks. Resources exist on these gradients, and your niche is which of the gradient you're capable of utilizing. Okay, so these are two different species, species A and B, and the gradient of resources, some given resource that they're capable of utilizing. Where their niches overlap, that's competition. Okay, so evolution, natural selection sees this as bad for both parties. Okay, so there's always an evolutionary pressure pushing these niches away from each other, separating them, increasing this niche separation, because where there is competition, you get less babies. Okay, so evolution always pushes species towards separate niches because of competition. Okay, the principle of competitive exclusion kind of gets at phylogenetic relatedness and competition. Okay, for any given niche in an environment, and I'm defining niche as every possible aspect of how you make a living, all right, all the resources that you use. For any given niche, there can really be only one species filling it, because one will always be better than another, and it will drive the other one to extinction, at least locally in that area. Okay, we've got here are two figures. The one on the left is showing this paramecium species and this paramecium species their population density over time. But these species were grown separately, just in little petri dishes. Okay, so grown separately, this is what their population looks like. Give them the exact same environment, but grow them together in the same petri dish, and this is what we see. One will always beat the other because it's better at utilizing those resources. If you were to change the chemical makeup in that petri dish, maybe the second paramecium would have been the one to win because it's capable of utilizing those resources better. But that's the principle of competitive exclusion. There can be only one that takes up an entire niche. Okay. Niches can be broken up into fundamental and realized. Okay. The fundamental niche is that entire resource gradient that you can use. Okay. And the realized niche is that resource gradient minus the competitive stuff where others outcompete you. So we've got Thalamus and Balanus. Okay, these are barnacle species. And Thalamus here, the brown one, can grow in this entire region here, from low tide to high tide. Okay, that's where it's capable of growing. That's its fundamental niche. Okay, but Balanus happens to outcompete it in this region. Okay, so the only place where Thalamus does grow when Balanus is present is in this narrow band. That's its realized niche. Okay, because it gets outcompeted for this gradient of the resource, which is tidal space. Okay, so fundamental niche is what you can use. That's what you want to use. The realized niche is where you don't get outcompeted in that resource. Okay. And so this leads to resource partitioning. In any given habitat, resources are kind of partitioned amongst different species. And this is just a result of evolution, competitive exclusion, and the realized niches. Okay. So evolution's always pushing things towards separate niches because competition's bad for everybody. In any given resource gradient, one's always going to be better than the other. Okay. And that leads to realized niches. Those realized niches lead directly into resource partitioning, and this is just to avoid competition. So this is competition avoidance. All right. So any resource, whether it's temporal, like what part of the day are you active? Spatial, just like Thalamus and Balanus growing on the tidal rocks. Acoustical, what frequency are you doing your mating call in? Okay. The electromagnetic spectrum, which parts of the sunlight are you best capable of using? All right. Resource partitioning is just how resources are divided up amongst different species in a community. All right. So one example here is like songbird, song frequency and duration and all that kind of stuff. So if you're in a really dense forest trying to call to a mate and your song sounds exactly like another species, that's competition. And so evolution is going to push you to have a different mating call. All right. So if you go to a dense forest, you hear all these different sounds, you're listening to resource partitioning in action. So here's a lovely picture of a community with what I assume are well partitioned resources, and there's a lot wrong with this. Well, we've got species found in Madagascar only, with species from mainland North America or Central America and Asia, and it's just not realistic. But especially not realistic is this idea of everything kind of being in natural harmony, ecosystems being balanced, reaching some peak plateau of diversity, and just being shiny, happy people holding hands. Okay. Instead of this, I will turn to my favorite German philosopher, Werner Herzog. Mr. Herzog is about to describe his impressions of the jungle. He lived there for a year making a film in the Amazon, and he called it a harmony of overwhelming and collective murder. Let's watch.
It's vile and base. I wouldn't see anything erotical here. I would see fornication and asphyxiation and choking and fighting for survival and growing and just rotting away. Of course, there's a lot of misery, but it is the same misery that is all around us. The trees here are in misery and the birds are in misery. I don't think they sing, they just screech in pain. Taking a close look at what's around us, there is some sort of a harmony. It is the harmony of overwhelming and collective murder.
Ooh, that seems like a pretty bleak outlook.
No, it's amazing. I love it. Murder.
So, this harmony of overwhelming and collective murder leads to what appears to be a nice harmonic balance in some ecosystems. But really, it's a struggle. It's a struggle for survival, and that's what drives natural selection. And it's things eating each other and competing for resources and driving each other to extinction. And it's a constantly shifting mosaic of responding to diseases or fire disturbances or clear cutting, and all of this kind of drives at the food chain. Okay, that's my segue. Deal with it. Okay, this is picturing a trophic structure. Okay, this is the food web. How many links are in this food web? Well, there's a bunch of different species. They're all eating each other. How many links are in a given food chain, where we move from a primary producer like phytoplankton to a consumer like this clam, to a secondary consumer that eats the clam, to a tertiary one that eats the thing that eats the clam that ate the phytoplankton, to a quaternary which eats the thing which eats the thing which eats the thing which eats the thing which ate the phytoplankton. Okay, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 links in that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe. Okay. The longest food chain that we know of has 7 links in it. So as you go up trophic levels, it gets harder and harder to support biomass. Okay. And that's because big, fierce animals are very rare due to the second law of thermodynamics. Every biochemical reaction that happens inside of one of your cells is not 100% efficient. Some of it's lost to entropy, which is measured in heat. Okay, so each time you eat a molecule of carbon, some of that carbon is going to get put into biomass, making more of you. Some of it's going to possibly go to performing biochemical reactions that keep you alive. Okay, so if we look at primary productivity and we say that there's 10,000 calories fixed in the grass here, that's the amount of sunlight and CO2 turned into sugar. 10,000 calories of usable carbon. A rabbit could eat all that 10,000 calories, but only make 1,000 more calories of rabbit. The 9,000 other calories that the rabbit ate are lost to heat. So every step in a food chain, you're losing 90% of the calories to biochemical reactions, metabolism, that heat loss. Okay. A snake here is a secondary consumer. if it has 1,000 calories of rabbit available to it, then it's able to make 100 calories of new snake. A tertiary consumer can only make 10 calories of eagle out of that 100 calories that it ate of the snake. And the snake only was able to make 100 calories of snake from 1,000 calories of rabbit, which needed 10,000 calories of primary productivity. Okay, so as you go up the food chain, you require an exponentially increasing amount of primary productivity to support each new link in that food chain. So this is probably why the longest food chain we know of is 7 links. Okay, that takes a massive amount of primary productivity to support that many links in a food chain.